All right, Rabbi, good morning, a good tevach. It's this great zuchos Baruch Hashem to be able to continue, begin a new week with an incredible Masechta, really incredible Gemaras ahead of us. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsim Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drashos this year as a zuchos for Besoros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Haba Alinu Latova, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, and thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim, both the revealed and the hidden. For the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago, and for Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, and the merit of the speedy arrival of Mashiach. Amen. Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Eretz Yisrael, in commemoration of the second yahrzeit of Batsheva's father, Reb Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vea, Philadelphia, which is on the 7th of Tammuz, a child survivor of Auschwitz. He left this world with over 100 descendants. Incredible. And our week of learning sponsor, Binyamin Fleisch, in memory of his father, Rabbi Shmuel Yudel ben Binyamin Yaakov Zichron Livracha. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas Lav and Aliyah, all the families who have a Nechama, all those who need a refuah Shavon together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu Shneimers Hashem, bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'Chol Masei Yedayim should shower Shmir Yisera and Hashkach upon our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, and Halavai we should be Zochem Meretz Hashem to a week of tremendous Gula, a week of tremendous Bracha, and a week of tremendous Nisim for Klal Yisrael. Well, with that, buckle your seatbelt, because you thought yesterday was incredible, you thought last week was incredible. Wait till you see what Chazal have in store for us today. Today's daf is Yud Aleph. We actually made good ground yesterday. Helps to have an hour and 15 minutes for sure, right? We made good ground yesterday, so we left off on Yud Amud Beis 10b, and we left off second to last line from the end, right? We ended up, Rabbi, yesterday with Bacha Rebbe. Remember the dramatic story of Antoninos? And ultimately, again, his relationship with Rebbe. Then again, the Katia Bar Shalom, who we saw as well. And again, how Katia Bar Shalom goes to his death after literally giving himself a bris milah and entering into Olam Haba, the Bas Kol confirming that he was a member of Olam Haba. So I just wanted to point out this statement of Rebbe, which Rabbi Yaakov just reminded me before, is also, we'll see this statement of Rebbe, Bacha Rebbe. Rebbe cried because he said, again, the Lashon was, Yeshkana Olama b'sha achas, v'yeshkana Olama b'kama shanim. So literally translated, there are those who acquire their portion in the world to come in one moment, and there are those who acquire their portion in the world to come over many years. So in general, the way that statement of Rebbe is understood is that there are some people, it takes them a lifetime to accomplish something great, and there are some people who accomplish something great in a moment. The Maharsha actually has a very novel and beautiful interpretation of this statement, and the Maharsha says like this, listen to this, his lashon is like this. He says, V'abacha Rebbe Yahu, D'lo kan olam rak b'sha'ach ha'shenerag, v'yatza min ha'olam, v'lo zacha l'madrega ha'yoser gidola, liknos olama b'kama shanim. Rebbe was coming to the Maharsha. Rebbe was crying about something different. Rebbe was crying about this guy, Katia Bar Shalom, because he said, listen to what this guy, look what he accomplished in one moment. Can you imagine what he would have accomplished had he had more time on this earth? Bacha Rebbe, which actually makes a lot of sense, because the shaila is what I think was bothering the Maharsha, is why is Rebbe crying? Right? Why is he, like, what's the tears? And what Rebbe is crying about is sometimes you see someone accomplish something so great in life, and then you recognize if they just had more time, they would have been able to accomplish so much more. You know, sometimes in life we see this, Rahman al-Islam, when a young person dies, that tragedy of a life cut short. What is it that is so sad about a life cut short? It's the sadness of seeing what could have been. As much as this person accomplished in a short lifetime, they could have been so much more. And that pain is gnawing inside of those who are left behind. That's what Rebbe was crying about, says the Maharsha. Katia Bar Shalom accomplished so much in a relatively short time. He was kan olam b'sha achos. Imagine what he could have done with more time, which Rabosai is, and the reason I wanted, even though we did this in yesterday's daf, the reason I wanted to start out with this Gemara today, because it's Sunday, beginning of a new week. Rabosai, the greatest gift in life is not your wealth, it's not even your health. The greatest gift in life is time. And if we have it, the Ribono Shel Olam urges us to maximize it. Yeah, you could accomplish something great in sha'achas in one moment, but imagine what you could ultimately accomplish bekama shanim, in many years. And those of us who are here today, Baruch Hashem, are the beneficiaries of the Ribono Shel Olam's gift of time. It's a new day, it's a new week. Make a plan. Decide what you're going to accomplish. Decide what you're going to do. Decide what you're going to be. Because when you have kama shanim, there is no telling what you could accomplish. Incredible, Rabbi say. All right, so with that, let's go weiter. Antoninos. So we'll say very beautiful Gemara. Antoninos. Sham shel Rabbi. Adkaran sham shel Rav. So again, as we were saying before, Antoninos served Rabbi, right? And another guy by the name of Adkaran, or Adrakon, or Adarkon, I should say, served Rav. Now again, the Gemara doesn't really give us any type of historical background on this guy Adarkon, but he served Rav. Kishachav Antoninos, so Abba says very beautiful, when Antoninos passed away, Rabbi Nispar de Chavila, literally means the package or the rope has unraveled. In other words, what Rebbe was highlighting over here was a beautiful relationship that he had with Antoninos. And when Antoninos passed away, so the rope unraveled, the relationship unraveled. Kishach v'Adarkon, when Adarkon died, Amarav, Nispar Tabav Yudalif, Nispar de Chavila. Ultimately, the rope or the package unraveled. Now, Rashi points out over here, what does this mean? And Rashi says, Avasenu, shenikshra nefesh benefesh. What both Rebbe and Rav were saying was ultimately, again, that they had a very deep relationship with these individuals. Rebbe had a deep relationship with Antoninos, right? And ultimately, again, Rav had a very deep relationship with Adarkon. So ultimately, again, when these individuals died, there was a feeling of loss. Now, we'll say, ultimately, what's the point of this Gemara? What is this saying? I think the Gemara is highlighting to us something that is incredibly profound, which is the ability of Jew and non-Jew to form beautiful and meaningful and spiritually uplifting relationships. You know, as much as we're going to see so much of Avoda Zara is about going ahead and creating barriers between Jewish and non-Jewish relationships, a fear of intermarriage, a fear of idolatry. But the way humanity is supposed to work is that there is supposed to be a synergistic partnership between Am Yisrael and the nations of the world. That's why Baruch Hu, there is a community of humanity. There's a community of mankind. And when mankind is serving a similar purpose of the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of ultimately, again, becoming Bnei Aliyah, there is no telling what we can accomplish. Rebbe had a relationship like this with Antoninos, and Rav had a relationship like this with Adarkon. And when there is this ability to create this synergistic partnership between Jew and Gentile, ultimately for the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all of humanity is uplifted. All right, Mosai, get ready for this story. Onkelos bar Clonimus, Igayer. So a man by the name of Onkelos, the son of Clonimus, converted. Now, Mosai, there is a tremendous amount of debate whether or not this is Onkelos, who's like Onkelos in the Chumash. Is this Onkelos or just another man by the name of Onkelos? Again, just a debate. So what happened? He converted. Now, both say this guy was a significant Roman personality. A significant Roman personality. We know this why. Kashadar Kesar Gunda Dramai Abasrai. Because the Caesar sent a troop of soldiers to arrest him. Now, obviously, again, he must have been prominent, because if he wasn't prominent, no one would have really cared, right? So the main again is Onkelos converts. The Caesar sends a troop of soldiers to arrest him. So what happens? About it's incredible. Mashchinu Bakrai. So Onkelos engaged them in a discussion about Yiddishkeit, and what happened? Igayer. They converted. Can you imagine that? First of all, just to see who this man Onkelos was. You know, even if it wasn't the person who wrote the Perush on Chumash Onkelos, can you imagine that? Having that type of sway, that a group of Roman soldiers come along and ultimately also, by the way, the Lashon over here is, what's the Lashon? Mashchinu B'krai. What does Mashchinu B'krai? What does that mean? What does that mean? He took them, which definitely means he taught them Chasidus. And that must be what happened over here. He taught a little Piazetzna, right? It was no shy. This was not the Rab Chaim. I'm just pointing out, right? This is not like a Lamdish Ashir over here. He came a little Chasidus. They probably branged a little bit, made a L'chaim, right? And because that's Lashon Mashchinu. We'll say, you know, Yiddishkeit, when you do it the right way, it pulls your soul. It pulls your soul. You can't get out of its grasp, really, because you don't want to get out of its grasp. So Onkelos starts to talk to them about Yiddishkeit. Again, probably quite literally, a little Chaim, a little bit of Chasidus, and it pulls their soul into it. They convert, okay? So what happens? Hadar Shadar Gunda Diramai Achrina. the Caesar, Caesar sent another group of soldiers to go ahead and arrest Onkelos. Amar lahu, lo temru lei v'lo midi, don't talk to him. Whatever you do, don't engage Onkelos, right? Don't have a conversation with him, don't talk with him. Ki havashak l'va'azl, okay? So what happens, the soldiers come, they get Onkelos, and I will say, by the way, interesting enough also from this is, doesn't sound like Onkelos is like hiding out, right? In other words, it's not like, doesn't sound, they get him, and they're bringing him back to the Caesar, okay? Amar lahu, eimel lechu milsa ba'alma. So Onkelos says, you know what, guys, I know you're not allowed to talk to me, but I just want to share with you a thought, right? Just a vart, just a vart. You don't have to respond, right? Here's the vart, right? Nifriyu, or is it say nifyura nakat nura kame pifyura. So we'll say, so these were different stations of Roman nobility. So for example, a nifyura carries the torch in front of the pifyura. Pifyura l'dochsa. A pifyura is subservient to the duchsa, right? He carries it before the duchsa. Duchsa lehegmona, the duchsa carries the torch before the hegmona. Hegmona lekuma carries it before the kuma. Again, these are all different higher levels of nobility. Kuma minakit mikame inshi, but the kuma, who apparently is like the highest station, Rashi says over here, that's the melech, that's the king. The Caesar, he doesn't hold the torch before anyone, right? Obviously, he holds it, only people hold the torch for him. He doesn't hold the torch before anyone. So they responded, and here was their mistake. They engaged, right? They engaged, and they said, they responded to Onkelos, said, no, of course, the Caesar, the king, doesn't hold the torch for anyone. So the Caesar, listen to this. Amar lahu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nakat nura kame Yisrael. And then Onkelos says, let me tell you the most incredible thing about Yiddishkeit. The Jewish people have a God, and their God carries a torch before them. Dichsiv, Vashem holech lifnehem yomam. Now again, ultimately again in the desert, HaKadosh Baruch Hu walked before us in the form of a fire each and every day. After hearing this, Igayer, they converted. So the second group of soldiers now converted, I will say. But just so you appreciate what happened over here, right? So Onkelos explains to them in a human model, right? The less important person serves the more important person. And when you finally get to the highest station in the kingdom, the king serves no one. Yet, when it comes ultimately again to Klal Yisrael, there's a king, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and yet the king, the Ribono Shel Olam, serves us. He serves Klal Yisrael. So we'll say they hear this and they convert. What's the pshat? What's on a most simple level? Onkelos says, do you understand the relationship that happens between Klal Yisrael and the Ribono Shel Olam? On one hand, he's our father, he's our king, but yet at the end of the day, he is there for us in anything and everything we need. The Ribono Shel Olam always has our back. I will say this is exactly what we spoke about yesterday morning, Shabbos morning in the Drasha. This is so, especially during these days in which we are living, how we have seen that the Melech descends from on high and literally takes care of us in every single way. The soldiers are so taken by this idea because remember again, in their model, right, of the human king model. So the king owes nothing to anyone, right? And the king, the subjects are there for the king. The notion of a king who is a king, but yet is there for his servants, the Ribono Shel Olam, takes them so much that they convert. Okay, third group of soldiers. Caesar's getting a little bit frustrated, as you can imagine. He sends a third group of soldiers to arrest Onkelos. Amar lo, lo tishta'u midi. He gives them instructions. Don't talk to Onkelos, right? Don't engage him, don't answer, nothing. Just leave it. So kinakti leva azli. So what happened? Okay, so they come, they arrest him and taking him out. As they're taking him out, chaza mizuzasa demancha apischa. So Onkelos saw a mezuzah that was on the doorway, right? There was a mezuzah that was on the doorway. Osiv yadei Allah, he touched the mezuzah. Now we'll say, right, he touched the mezuzah. V'amar lahu, my high. Oh, all right. So what happens? The soldier said to him, "What was that? Right? What was that? What was that that you touched? You touched this thing on the doorway. What was that?" So Amrulay. Sorry. V'amar lahu, my high. So interestingly enough, so what happens? Onkelos says to these guys, "Chaver, like, do you want to know what that was?" Like he baits them a little bit. I don't have to tell you. But if you're curious, would you like to know what that was? Amrulay Imalan. He said yes. Okay. So he said yes. What was that whole thing with the thing that you're touching on the doorway? So Amrulahu, Minhago was so beautiful. Minhago Shel Olam, Melech Basar Vadam, Yoshev Mibifnim, Va'avoda Mishamim also Mibachotz. You know, in a human ruler, the king sits on the inside and his subjects, right? The king is in an inner room, an inner throne room. And what happens? And his servants are on the outside guarding him. We, his servants, we sit inside. And what happens? And ultimately, the Ribono Shel Olam watches us on the outside. Isn't that incredible? The mezuzah represents the safety and security. So the king, I'm in my house, dwelling safely and securely. Why? Because the king is on the outside looking in on me. Normally, again, the subjects stand guard for the king, but by Jews, the king stands guard for the subject. Shne'emar, Hashem yishmar tzeischa uva'echa me'ata vi'ad olam. The Ribono Shel Olam shall always watch your going and your coming from now and forever. They heard this, Igayer, and they converted. Rabbi said, just point out over here, after this, the Caesar gave up. The Caesar gave up. He's like, I'm done, right? Already again, he created already again, Baruch Hashem, multiple new minyanim in Klal Yisrael, right? Baruch Hashem, so incredible. He just gave up. The story is incredible for a number of reasons. First, Rabbi say, the notion, the concept of kissing the mezuzah comes from this story. Right now, I'll point out over here, if you notice, Onkelos did not kiss the mezuzah. What did he do? He touched the mezuzah. So, for example, the Kitzur brings down, interestingly enough, that the custom is to touch the mezuzah. Some have the custom to kiss the mezuzah, but really the ikar idea is to place your hand upon the mezuzah when you come in and out of the room as a form of recognition. Kissing is an additional form of chavivus, an additional form of love. But ultimately, again, that practice stems from this story of Onkelos. I will say, what's the most incredible thing about this, right? Onkelos really highlighted three basic ideas, right? Number one, that Yiddishkeit, if we do it the right way, pulls us in. Mashchinua pulls us in. That's number one. Number two, Onkelos highlighted the beauty of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Part one, that ultimately the king is here to serve us. Ribono Shel Olam wants to serve us. And part two, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to protect us. And I will say, what's incredible about this? What's incredible about this is, I think, why is it that Onkelos was the one who said this? Why? Because sometimes when you come to something on your own, you have a different level of appreciation than if you're born into it. We see this all the time. Sometimes, you see a ger, you see a convert, and how do you feel? If you're honest, how do you feel when you see the convert? How do you feel? A shtickle jealous, right? Why? I wish I was as on fire as that person. Or sometimes you see with the Baal Tshuva also, right? Someone again who found something. You're like, I wish I had that. Why? Because like most things in life, if you have it and you always had it, sometimes it just becomes rote. It just becomes regular. It just becomes mundane and everyday. What's so beautiful about this is Onkelos was able to perceive and to appreciate these nuanced pieces. There's no chidushim over here. Onkelos is not highlighting anything new. What is Onkelos doing? He's quoting a pasuk. He's quoting psukim. Nothing new. But because it was new to him, he saw the beauty in it in a way that sometimes conditioned eyes don't see. The goal, Rabbi, is to be a Jew who serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu like he's been a Yid since Har Sinai, but with the excitement and a freshness of a ger. That's the ultimate Jew. To have ultimately the Masorah, like all the way from Har Sinai, but the freshness of a convert. That was Onkelos. Incredible. All right, we'll say that's the story. Let's go back there. So again, this is by Rivka Yemina. Rivka is pregnant with Yaakov and Esav, and ultimately again she goes to Shem Ve'ever to say what's going on over here because Vayisrael Abana Mikirba, and she's told, Hashem tells her, there are two goyim, there are two nations in your womb. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, Atikri goyim ela goyim. Do not read it as goyim nations, but rather read it as goyim. Goyim literally means like princes, like royalty, proud people. Who is it referred to? Zeh Antoninos v'Rebbe. This refers to Antoninos and Rebbe, because as we saw before, remember again, the most dramatic concept about the relationship between Antoninos and Rebbe is Antoninos, the Caesar, Rome, right? Esav, Rebbe, Jewish, Yaakov. It was Yaakov and Esav ultimately again interfacing. So the Gemara says, and again, what was about Rebbe and Antoninos? Lo chazaras, v'lo kishos, v'lo tznon. They always had lettuce, they always had cucumbers, and they always had radishes. Lo b'mosacham, lo b'mosacham. They never ran out. They're always on their table, both during the winter and summer. Now, we'll say, what's so special about it? I don't know, tell me meat, wine, what's so special about a salad? It's very nice. They always had salad. Shkoya, they always had salad. What's the pshat? It's very important. We'll say first wide line, snon mechatech ochel, chazeres mehapech machal, kishos marchiv me'ayim, literally translated, radishes cause digestion. Chazeres, so radishes and lettuce aid in digestion, and apparently cucumbers widen the intestines. In other words, these are all good foods to help with digestion. Why do you need good digestion? If you're eating a lot. So this idea that they always had vegetables meant they always needed digestive aids. Why? Because Baruch Hashem, there was a lot of food being served at their table. Avoda, the Rabbi Shmuel says, second wide line. Lama nikra shma kishuin. But why does it say ultimately? Why are cucumbers called kishuin? Because apparently cucumbers are as destructive to the body like swords. So stira, cucumbers are good, cucumbers are bad. To which the Gemara says, lokashya. Again, I will say, so two ways to understand this over here. Either Rav Ravi and Zuchri means small cucumbers and large cucumbers. Then apparently, again, small ones are beneficial, large ones are detrimental. Or could we be talking about quantity? Then maybe large quantities are detrimental, smaller quantities could be helpful. Okay. Yomi. So we'll say, so back to the Mishnah. So remember again, we're talking about Yamin Tovim, Avoda Zara Yamin Tovim. Now, if you remember again, so the Mishnah said the birthday of the king and the yahrzeit, the date of death of the king. Now, in that same Mishnah, Rabbi Meir said like this. Rabbi Meir was on record as saying, Rabbi Meir said, the Chachamim said like this: the only time that the day of death of the king is a day of Avodah Zara is if it's a day of Sreifa, where they're burning the king's stuff, which we'll discuss. If they're burning the king's possession, that means the king apparently was very chashuv, and therefore, again, that would be a day that they worship Avodah Zara. But the Chum say if there's no sreifa, if there's no burning happening, then it's not Avodah Zara. Machlokes in the Chum and Rabbi Meir, to which the Gemara says, Salons de Michlal, the Rabbi Meir Savar, Lo shna misa sheish basreifa, v'lo shna misa she'in basreifa, palchi bala avodas kochavim. So we'll say, so it sounds like according to Rabbi Meir, whether it's a death that has sreifa, that has the burning of possessions, or doesn't have the burning of possessions, either way, the day of death of the king is a day of avodah zara. Alma, now we'll say, what do you see from here? Sreifa lav chukahi. What you see from here, I will say, is that the burning of possessions of a king is not an idolatrous practice. Michlal, D'Rabbanan Sabri, Sreifa Chukahi, which makes it sound like that according to the rabbis, the burning of the possessions of a king after his death is an idolatrous practice. You must listen to this. Vatani, we learned, Sarfin ala malachim, v'lo midarchei amori. So we'll say, this is fascinating. Apparently, even by Jewish kings, when a king died, it was common to burn his possessions. Now, which possessions we will see, and the Gemara says you're allowed to do this, and this is not called emulating the ways of the Goyim. Now, I will say, there are two things that are happening over here. There's a general concern of Avodah Zara. In addition, even if something is not actually idolatrous in nature, there's a concept of darchei amori. Darchei amori means emulating Gentile practices, which we are not allowed to do. So the Gemara says when a Jewish king dies, you are allowed to go ahead and burn his possessions, and obviously not only is it not Avodah Zara, but it's not even considered to be emulation of Gentile ways. And I both say, just as an aside, what would be the pshat, ultimately of burning the king's possessions? The idea is that after the king dies, no one should use his stuff, right? The reason why that was done was that created a certain level of heightened reverence for the monarchy, right? Therefore, again, it wasn't considered to be Avodah Zara. It's not even considered to be emulated Gentile practices, because it serves a higher purpose of elevating the status of the king in the eyes of the nation. Incredible. So the Gemara says, V'i chukahu anan heichis afinon. Now, if at the end of the day, again, burning possessions of the king was an idolatrous practice, then how would we be permitted to do it? V'aksiv u'b'chukosem lo selechu. Both say the halach is we are not permitted to emulate the ways of the Goyim. We are not permitted to emulate the ways of the Gentiles of the world. Ella, the kuli alma sreifa lav chukahi. Rather, in reality, everyone agrees that burning the possessions of a king after he dies is not considered to be emulating the ways of the Gentiles. Ella chashivusahi. It's done for chashivus, right? It's done for kavod for the king. V'acha, so it's machlokes here in our Mishnah. V'acha b'hakam ifli. Here's the machlokes. Rabbi Meir Savar lo shna misa sheish basreifa, v'lo shna misa she'en basreifa, palchi ba la'avodas kochavim. Rabbi Meir says like this: when a Gentile king died, whether they were burning his possessions or not burning his possessions, it didn't really matter. One thing was clear, that when he died and they celebrated his date of death or commemorated his date of death, they were worshiping their idols. That was always there. The Rabbanan Sarvino, the Rabbanan held no. Misa sheish basreifa chashiv lehu palchiba, v'she'in basreifa lo chashiva v'lo palchiba. The Rabbanan disagreed. The Rabbanan say, listen, there were different kings of different stature. So if the king was chashiv enough that they would burn his possessions, then they would also worship their idols. But if he was not chashiv enough that they would burn his possessions, they would not worship their idols. Okay? So it says the Gemara both say, Gufa, sarfin ala malachim ve'imom mishum darchei emori. So now we're transitioning a little bit, and this is really very interesting. The Gemara says, so very interesting, the idea over here is that they would go ahead and burn the possessions of a Jewish king. Right, which is really quite amazing. Why? So you could burn the possessions ultimately again of Jewish kings, and this is not considered to be emulation of Gentile practices. Shneimar b'shalom tamus or b'misrafos avosecha hamalachim. So again, the Navi Yirmiyah is talking to Tzidkiyahu, King Tzidkiyahu, and he tells Tzidkiyahu, you will die peacefully, and again, b'misrafos avosecha hamalachim. And you will be burned, or literally again, they'll be burning together with your father, the kings. Now, obviously, it's not talking about burning like cremation. Rather, what is it referring to? It's referring ultimately again to the burning of possessions. So you see here that the Navi himself makes reference to the burning of the possessions of the king. Now, both say, by the way, what's incredible about this is two things incredible about it. Number one, what's incredible about it is that it seems that the Goyim were doing it also. So that's fascinating, but because again, it wasn't done for the purpose of Gentile emulation, but rather for Chashivos, it was permitted. What's also fascinating about it is, we have the concept of Baltashchis, right? Baltashchis means the prohibition to engage in unnecessary or wanton destruction. But remember again, this is not Baltashchis. Why is it not Baltashchis? Why not? Why not? Because it's necessary. Remember again, Baltashchis means unnecessary destruction. So I'll give you a good example of this. Rahman al-Islam, a person loses a loved one, right? The halacha is they tear kriya. How are you allowed to tear kriya? How are you allowed to tear your clothing? It's Baltashchis. It's not Baltashchis, because Baltashchis means unnecessary destruction. But when the destruction serves a purpose, it's not unnecessary. So the same Rahman al-Islam, a mourner is allowed to tear his clothing out of mourning for his parent, his sibling, whoever it is. So Lamaisa, that's not Baltashchis. So destroying burning the possessions of the king ultimately amplifies the covet of the monarchy, and amplifying the covet of the monarchy is important because what that does is that respect pays out dividends societally. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, same way that they would go in and burn the possessions of kings, they would also burn the possessions of the Nasi. Now, both say, who's the Nasi? The Nasi was the head of the Sanhedrin. So the Gemara says, by the way, what do they burn? What possessions would they burn for the king? Mitasan, his bed, uklei tashmishan. And ultimately, again, he's like almost like everyday personal items. Right? The stuff that he would use day in and day out. One time Rabbi Gamliel the elder died, he was the Nasi. V'saraf alav unkulus hager shivim mana tsuri. And unkulus the ger, we'll say unkulus, top of the Amid. Unkulus hager, Unculus burnt or destroyed 70 silver mana. One second. But why would Unculus just destroy silver? In other words, well, what's the pshat with that? We just said before, whatever you're destroying their possessions, the stuff, the utensils that they use day in and day out. Ema b'shivim manatsuri. No. What it means is Unculus destroyed, he burnt the possessions of Rabbi Gamliel HaZaken that were worth 70 silver mana. Okay, incredible. So that's it. We don't destroy anything else. In other words, so what it sounds like over here is for the king, we burn his bed and his like utensils of daily living. That's it. So Okrin ala malachim ve'in ba mishum darchei emori. So this is very interesting. Okrin means, Rashi says over here, behema hagidin levad sha'al parasosel okrin v'chotech. So both say what they would do is they would cut the tendon of the king's horse. That would preclude it from galloping. So in other words, they didn't want anyone else using the king's horse. So they didn't put down the animal. But what they did was they did something to the foot or to a tendon in the leg that prevented the animal from galloping. Thereby, and no one else would be able to ride the king's horse. So the Gemara says, yeah, which horse is that? That's the horse that the king himself rode on. And therefore that falls under the umbrella of the utensils that the king would use day in and day out. Ubehema Torah, though, was it only his horse and not any other animals? So the Gemara says, Vatanya, we learned, Ikur sheyish bo treifa aser, v'she'in bo treifa mutter. The Rabbi say, when literally, again, crippling the animal, you could only cripple it in a way that would not make it into a treifa. But you can't cripple it in a way that would make it to Rabbi say, now the lashon of treifa is dafka, a word that's used by kosher animals, right? So what's the pshat over here that you'd be using it by a horse? Ve'ezu ikur she'im b'treifa. What's the type of ikur that would make the animal that doesn't make the animal a treifa? Amud beis haminasher parsosem minar kuva ulamata. So as I say, interestingly enough, so everything depends on where you cut. You would cut this tendon. If you would cut it lower to the hoof, that's fine because that prevents it from galloping, but doesn't make it into a treifa. If you do it a little bit higher on the leg, that could actually make it into a treifa. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Gemara Papa, be'egla hamosheches bekaron. You're right, we'll say it's not just the horse, but sometimes a king would have like a large ox, which would pull his carriage. Interesting. I don't know, never thought of that before. But I guess sometimes you'd have like oxen pulling your carriage, right? So the mice, again, that would be an example. They would also go ahead and cripple that animal so that it couldn't pull a carriage anymore after the king's death. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, and the Rambam quotes this, by the way. This was absolutely a practice that was done by Jewish kings. That when a Jewish king would die, they would they would destroy his stuff, again, specifically the items that he used in everyday life, and they would cut the tendon of his horse in a way that didn't make or his ox, in a way that wouldn't make the animal treifa, prevent the animal from galloping, and therefore no one else would be able to use his own animals after his death. Incredible. Yom Tag Lachas Zekanot. So I'll say, so remember again, then the Mishnah then went on to what we call like personal Yomim Tovim, right? So personal Yomim Tovim were these days where the Akum himself was celebrating some type of personal milestone event. So it wasn't like a general Yom Tiv, it was his own Yom Tiv. So we'll say, what were examples of this? The day in which he cut his beard, right? Or the day in which he cut his beloris, his ponytail. What is it? His chup. Right, well, no, it was a back chop, right? A back chop, right? See, he went ahead and he cut his ponytail. So the Gemara says, "Bailahu." This is very interesting. Heichi katani, yom taglachas zekano v'hanachas below riso, ol dilma yom taglachas zekano v'avaras below riso. So what was this? In other words, was it a day of like where he cut his beard and left his beloris? Like in other words, is that you would leave your beard, right? You would cut your beard and leave your beloris, or it was just a day of like full shaving, right? You cut your beard and you cut your beloris. So when it says Tashman desanya tarvayu yom taglachas zekano v'hanachas. I'm sorry, tarvayu yom taglachas zekano v'hanachas beloriso yom taglachas zekano v'avaras beloriso. The answer is it was both. Sometimes again it was Yom Tiv when you cut your beard and your beloris, and sometimes again you cut the beard, you leave that beloris. That's also Yom Tiv. Okay, either way. So we'll say an incredible, overwhelming Gemara now. I'm going to be Rabbi Shmuel. Get ready for this. This is overwhelming. Od Yom Achares Yesh LaMeromi. I'll say, get ready for this. There was another Yom Tov in Rome. One more Yom Tov that wasn't mentioned by the Mishnah. We'll discuss why that is. Achos l'shivim shana. This holiday was only celebrated once every 7 years. And what would they do? Mevi'in Adam Shalem umarkiven osal Adam Chiger. They would bring two people, and they would bring a totally healthy person and a crippled person. And what would happen? They would put the healthy person on the shoulders of the crippled person. Okay, so we'll say we're going to see over here now. Just let's go through the symbolism as the story is unfolding. Rashi says over here, Adam Shalem kineged Esav, the healthy person represented Esav. Adam Chiger, the crippled person, kineged Yaakov. Soleya al Yerecho. Kilomar Adayin Esav Sholet al Yaakov. So once every 70 years in Rome, they celebrated the following Yom Tiv. Two people. One was crippled, one was whole. The crippled one, he represented Yaakov. Yaakov, after he was limping. Remember again, Yaakov fights against the Sarah Shal Esav the whole night. Because remember again, all the Torah tells us by that strange encounter of Yaakov is Vayivasa Yaakov levado, Vayeavek ish imo ad alos hashachar. So ultimately, again, Yaakov Avinu comes along, right, and he's fighting. We don't know who it is. Rashi HaKodesh identifies it as he was fighting with the ministering angel of Esav. See, he remained standing, but he's crippled the next day. So they would bring a guy the crippled guy would be Yaakov, and they put a healthy guy on the shoulders of the crippled guy. The healthy guy, that was Esav. And it was to show Esav's dominance over Yaakov. Esav is riding on the shoulders of Yaakov. Okay. Umalbishon osam oso big day Adam Arishon. And they would have the guy, we'll call him the Esav guy, right? The healthy guy. He would be wearing the clothing of Adam Harishon. Now, again, I will say, Rashi says, Vehain, big day chamudos shahayla Esav. Now, remember again, Esav had big day chamudos, had beautiful clothing. That remember, he did not keep with his wives. Who did he keep it with? Kept it with his mother. What were those? What was that clothing? Apparently, again, Chazal tells us that was the clothing of Adam Arishon, right? Adam, it was taken by Nimrod, right? Given by Nimrod, taken from Nimrod to Esav. Esav had his clothing. So again, whether this means that in Rome they actually had these clothing of Adam Arishon or a replica. So the guy on top, right, the healthy guy, represented Esav. He would be wearing the clothing of Adam Arishon. Let's get ready for this. Umanichin lo barosho karkiflo shel Rabbi Shmuel. I was saying, it's overwhelming. And by the way, overwhelming that they were doing this Gemara also in Chodesh Tammuz. So look at Rashi, Karkif lo Rabbi Shmuel. I will say, this is Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol was one of the Asar Rugei Malchus, one of the 10 martyrs. And the tragic and overwhelming story that we read of Rabbi Shmuel, we do this in Eila Eskira. So Rashi says over here, Kohen Gadol, o meharugei Malchus. I'm reading Rashi. He was the Kohen Gadol. He was the high priest. And he was one of the martyrs. O mitoch Yafyav, Nichnas belev bas Kesar ve'evshita ar panov v'chanta ba'afar Simon shetei mikuyemes. And the daughter of the Caesar was so taken by Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol's physical beauty, that she had his face flayed from his body. That he died having the skin flayed off of his body, and the Caesar preserved his face. He was so able to preserve his face. But I'll say, by the way, just so you understand, just the multiple layers of this tragedy, because remember again, the Gemara Maseches Gittin, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol's own sons were sent to Rome, right? They both say this is the overwhelming story of the two beautiful children who were sold into servitude. Remember this? We read it in Kinnis also. Sold into servitude. Remember again, and then one day 2 masters came along. They said, "I have a beautiful Jewish boy, I have a beautiful Jewish girl. Let's get them together." Remember again, the Gemara tells the story that they were put in the same room. And the son says, "How could I father a child with a maidservant? I am the son of the Kohen Gadol." And the daughter says, How could I submit myself to a slave? I am the daughter of the Kohen Gadol." And they sat in their respective corners. And the Gemara says that when the son came up, they realized that they were brother and sister. And the Gemara says they fell into each other's arms. V'ga'o bebechi at shiyatzu nishmasa. And they cried and they cried and they cried until their souls left their body. So Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol meets a terrible fate. His children die somewhere far off in Rome. So they flayed. So what they would do is, they had like a Rabbi Shmuel mask. They had a mask. And what would happen? The Gemara says, so they would put the mask. The Gemara says, so what happens? The guy on top who represented Esav, he would put on the mask of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, right? So the top guy, again representing Esav, riding on the shoulders of crippled Yaakov, wearing the mask of rabbinic greatness, the clothing of Adam Arishon, and what would happen? V'tolei b'tzavarei miskal reish zuzah defiza, and he would wear a beautiful stone. That way, 200 zuz. And they would cover all the marketplaces with beautiful, precious stones as well. And they would announce the following: Sach kiri plastar. So what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Sach kiri plastar, cheshbon hakotzim kazuv. Literally, the calculation of the master was false. This was a reference to the prophecy of Yaakov Avinu. Nevuas Yaakov shekar labanav la'acharisem shesof negal kazavu. They cried out. They said, the prophecy of the masters. They were calling Yaakov the master. The prophecy of the master. This is a reference in Parshas Vayechi, when Yaakov Avinu tells his children ultimately a multiple prophecy is going to be redeemed. So they cried out in Rome, the prophecy is false. The Jewish people will never be redeemed. Achua demarna Zayafna, the brother of our master. So their master is Esav. The brother is Yaakov. The brother of our master is a liar. He's a forger. He's a cheat. Everything he said, Rashi says, Echav sha'adonenu Esav zayfenu Yaakov sherima la'esav achashav lital bracha lios gvir lechav. So first of all, they said, the prophecy of Yaakov is false. And not only that, the brother of our master is a cheat. What did he try to do? He tried to take the birthright from our master. He tried to take the birthright from Esav. The chami udelo chami lo chami. Whoever saw the celebration. Whoever didn't. I both say, now why not? Pretty much, you only got to see this once in your life. Why? Because they only did this once every 70 years. So they ended up by saying, Ma'ahani l'rama b'ramusei u'lezayafna b'zayfenusei. What does it help, right? What does the thief, how does the theft help the thief? And ultimately, again, how does the forgery help the forger? They're saying, Yaakov, you tried to take everything from our father and nothing worked. Rashi says over here, first of all, the chami, hara b'simchazu achshav ro'eu, u'mishe'ena ro'a achshav lo yirena od, da'ad ayin shana eno nasis. So if you saw it, you saw it. Because it only happens once every 70 years. Rashi says, Maya hani d'Rama, liYaakov sharima es Esav v'lakav es bechora. So, see Yaakov, you think you cheated us out of the bechora? You were wrong. You think that you schemed us out of the birthright? You're wrong. You're nothing and we're everything. So listen, now watch this. Simon, by how would they end off this celebration? Vai ledin kad yakom din. I would say, this is so strange. But look how they ended off the celebration. They said, but woe to us. Woe to Esav, kad yakom din, when Yaakov rises again. Woe to Esav, when Yaakov rises again. Why? Because Am Kilavi Yakum. Right? I would say, woe to Esav, absolutely incredible. So, right, after all of this celebration, right, after all of this jubilation, after all of this feeling of conquest, what do they whisper at the end of the celebration? But you know it's only temporary. Because Yaakov will rise up again. Because the lion may remain asleep, even for generations, even for millennia. But when the lion wakes up, you better get out of its way. But say, isn't that incredible? Absolutely incredible. Amar Ravashi. So Ravashi says as follows. So I will say, so this was the celebration. This was the celebration in Rome. And I will say, just understand the profundity just of the days in which we are living. I will say, it's overwhelming. This was the celebration in Rome. Because Rome, like every other nation of the world, celebrated their conquest over us and said, Jewish people, you are a shattered dream. You're nothing but a shattered dream. But every single nation always muttered under its breath the same thing. We know we can't vanquish you. We know we can't obliterate you. We know we can't erase you. So we'll celebrate it while we're riding on your shoulders, right? We'll celebrate while our foot is on your neck. But at the end of the day, we know that the day will come when you will rise up above us, when you will vanquish us, when you will outlive and you will outperform us. And I will say, I just want to point out something amazing. For thousands of years, just understand. For thousands of years, do you know how a Jew would feel when he would read this Gemara? I will say, do you know how our parents, or maybe even certainly our grandparents and great-grandparents, do you know how they felt when they read this Gemara? How did they feel? Right? Masayavo. We can't wait till this day comes. And I will say, we read this Gemara and we're living it. We're living it. Because we're living in days where Yaakov has thrown Esav off his shoulders, right? Where no one sits on top of us. Where ultimately, again, no one has their foot to our neck. Where no one ultimately, again, says that Klal Yisrael is the cripple who could be subjugated. Let's understand what this means. For 2,000 years, the Jews read this Gemara as an anticipatory wish. And for us, this is our reality. For 2,000 years, the dominant piece of the Gemara was the way Rome celebrated. And then the whisper at the end was, oh, if only we'll live to see it. And now, that last whisper, that's being sung out loud. That's being stated out loud, screamed out loud from the top of our lungs. At the end of the day, the rest of the celebration doesn't matter. Now, vai ledin kadyokum din. Yes, world, watch out. Watch out when the lion awakens. Watch out when Yaakov throws Esav off his shoulders. Watch what happens when the Jewish people rise up again. Abosai, it's not an anticipatory desire. It's life. It's reality. It's what's happening and unfolding right in front of our eyes. Overwhelming. Amar Rashi, Hechshila and Pel Rishayim. So again, these Rishayim, their own words betrayed them. Their own words betrayed them. I amru zayafna achua demarna kidika amri. If they would have said, the brother of our master is a forger, then it wouldn't make sense. Hasha de amri demarna zayafna. The way they said it, Abosai, was, the master is a forger. Marna gufe zayafna. It's almost like embedded in their own words was a recognition that Esav was lying about. So, everybody has a taina and Yaakov about stealing the birthright. Yaakov stole nothing. Yaakov bought the birthright. The chutzpah is on Esav. How can you sell something and still try to reclaim it? Done. My time of the chashiv. So 1 second. Why is this yontiv not in the Mishnah? Right? This is overwhelming. Why is this yontiv not in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Very simple. The Mishnah only counts Yomim Tovim that occurred on a yearly basis. This Yom Tov only occurred once every 70 years, therefore it's not reckoned. Incredible. So the Gemara says, okay, Hani Diramai. So we'll say, so these were also, up until now, we've really been focusing on Roman Yomim Tovim, Roman Idolatrous Yomim Tovim. What about Persians? Or the Parsoi Mai? What do the Persians have? Right? What do the Persians have? Persians, what you got, right? So again, so what do the Persians have? So the Gemara says, Mutradi, Turiski, Muhurniki, or Muhurin. Okay, so apparently they sound much less exciting than the Roman ones. I'm not going to lie, right? Again, I don't know what you guys have, right? But right? So the Persians have, right, less than the Romans. Okay. The Bavli, and I will say, by the way, just understand, this is important to know, right? Why is it important to know? This is not just like, we're just curious. Remember, because there's a halacha. What's the halacha? You're not allowed to do business, right? You can't do transactions with an akum. Again, for sure, at least on the day of the Yom Tov itself, but quite possibly even 3 days before. So you got to know you have to know what everyone's Avoda Zara is. So the Gemara says, the Bavloi Mai. What about the Babylonians? What are their Yomim Tovim? So Mahorniki, Va'aknisi, Bechanuni, Ve'eser Ba'adar. So this is interesting. So apparently the Babylonians had another Avodah Zarah Yom Tov on the 10th of Adar. Okay, that was their Avodah Zarah. Amrav Chanan Bar Chisda, Amrav Chanan Bar Amrav, Chamisha Bate Avodah Kochavim Kivuin Hein. There were 5 established houses of idolatry. So we'll say, so now the Gemara is transitioning off a little bit of the Yom Tovim, talking about again, there are 5 just like established centers of idolatrous worship. And where were they? Ve'eluhein, Beis Baal beBavel. There was Beis Baal. Baal, this was a type of, we'll say, not to be confused with Baal, Beis Ayin Aleph, Baal, or Baal, this was a different Avodah Zarah. Beis Nevo beKorsi, again, we'll say, this is the name of the idolatry, the house of Nevo in Korsi, Tarasa Shebe Mapag, a Avodah Zarah called Tarasa in a place called Mapag, Srifa Sheba Ashkelon, so again, Beis Srifa, Avodah Zarah of Srifa in Ashkelon, Nashra Sheba Aravia, and again, Avodah Zarah of Nashra in Arabia. So again, Rav Dimi came along and he said, "There's also Yerid Shebein Bechi." The Yerid, and what's the name? Yerid is like a shuk, like a fair, like a marketplace. So the Yerid in Ein Bechi, that was also a place of Avodah Zarah. Nidbecha Sheba'ako. Also, again, the Avodah Zarah, right? The Avodah Zarah of Nidbecha. These were houses of worship in Akko. Ika de Amri, another alternate version of this. Nisbira Sheba'ako, not Nidbecha, but Nisbira Sheba'ako. Rav Dimon Adam Masni Ipcha. He switched it around. Yerid Sheba'ako, no, it was the marketplace, right? The marketplace in Akko. Nidbecha Shebe'in Bechi. And again, the Avodah Zarah Nidbecha in Ein Bechi. Amni Rav Chanan Bar Rav Chisda Rav Chisda. We'll say first white line. My Kivu and Hein. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, what does it mean? The Gemara says, what does it mean that they are Kivuin? What does that mean that they're established? Amrli Haki Amravua Di Imach. Kivuin Hein Li Olam. Tedira Kula Shasa Palchilahu. What it means is, Rabbi saying that these places of Avodah Zarah 24/7. Right? Again, unlike other Avodah Zarah, where apparently the days of worship took place at certain times, and during the rest of the times, I guess it was just like closed, it was dormant. So Lemais, again, the places enumerated over here, there was idolatrous worship happening every single day. Amar Shmuel, Begola Eino Aser Nebosei. Now, by the way, now why is this important? Why is this important to know that at the end of the day, that there was idol worshiping happening every day? Because this is very important. What that would mean is the people who are part of that Avoda Zara, you cannot do business with them ever, right? Because remember, again, I guess to their credit, very committed chevra over here, but if they're worshiping idolatry every single day, that means the problem with engaging in any type of transaction with them is that they're going to go ahead and give thanks to their deity. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Amar Shmuel Bagola Eino Asr Al Yom Idam Bilvad. Ultimately, again, Shmuel said, in diaspora, so only the actual day of the Yom Tiv is Asr. Now, we already saw this before, right? Because remember, the idea was that in Chutz La'aretz, so the Avoda Zara are not as frum. They're a little bit off the derech, right? So the Maisa, again, they're not as committed to the Avoda Zara. Therefore, again, there's no 3-day prior to the Yom Tiv issue, only the day itself. The Yom Idam Nami. Sorry, Yom Idam Nami mi Aser. But one second, even on the day of the Yom Tiv, is it Asher to transact business with them? After all, the Gemara says, mi Aser Bahar Rav Yehuda Shari le Rav Barona lezabune chanra. But yet, ultimately, again, Rav Yehuda allowed Rav Barona to sell wine to the Avoda Zara, even on the day of their Yom Tiv. Again, this is in Chutz La'aretz. Or Rav Gidol lezabune chitin bechag sadetai, and again allowed Rav Gidol to go ahead and sell wheat again on the Yom Tiv of the merchants. This was an Avoda Zara day. So we'll say this is pretty incredible. So remember, again, here they're actually selling stuff to the Avoda Zara when on the actual day of the Yom Tiv itself. To which the Gemara says, no. Shani chag sadetai. The difference is the Yom Tiv of the merchants, of the idolatrous merchants, is different because it's not established. What does that mean? So take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, first of all, Bechagsa Detai. What is this Yom Tiv of the merchants? First white line in Rashi, Yom Lashana Miskabtzin Kol Sochri Yair Lecho Belishtos V'Locho G'Lashem Avodas Kochavim Plonis. So once a year, all of the merchants. So apparently this was like an Avoda Zara dafka, like for merchants. So all of the merchants would get together and they would drink and they would eat as a way of serving their Avoda Zara. So the Gemara says, "Delo kavia ein choshishin la kol kach im ein osin la b'chol shana." So apparently, again, as much as there was this day, if they missed it, they missed it. So because it was not such an established day, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it was felt that it didn't really have the status of a day of Avoda Zara, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda allowed Rav Barona and Rav Gidol to even sell produce ultimately again on these days to those particular merchants. Didn't have the status ultimately of an Avoda Zara. We'll say, incredible. First, I neglected to mention, although I'm not going to lie, I'm disappointed in our Chabad members that no one sponsored this year today in honor of the Rebbe's yard site. Baruch Meir, what's going on? I'm charging it to your account regardless. I'm just telling you right now. Right? Gimel Tammuz, the yard site of the Rebbe. I will say again, it's important for us to recognize the Babich Rebbe, Sekhatad V'Chosh L'Bracha, who changed the fabric of Klal Yisrael. And certainly again, what the Rebbe taught more than anything is a sense of Avas Yisrael, a sense of love for every single Jew, but more than love, a sense of achrayus for every single Jew. To feel a sense of responsibility, not only for your own ruchnius, but for the ruchnius of the other. The Rebbe taught us really what it means to be a member of Klal Yisrael's beautiful neshama should have an aliyah, and halavai we should all be zocheh to be inspired by his example, not only to worry about our own ruchnius, not only to worry about our own spirituality, but to feel a sense of achrayus and responsibility for the spiritual growth and success of the other. And if we can inculcate that within ourselves, there's no telling what our people will look like, and halavai, the bracha and hatzlacha that the coming week will bring. I will say, shkoyach. There is tachlis still. Unless you're Chabadnik, then you don't say tachlis. There's a yard site. But the Chassidim is always a yard site. But the Chassidim is always a yard site. All right, also have a great day, everyone. Everyone, have a great day.